which prohibits reference being made to any active criminal cases. Members should not therefore make any reference to any active case in which an individual has already been charged. I call the Home Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Child sexual abuse and exploitation are the most vile and horrific of crimes, involving rape, violence, coercive control, intimidation, manipulation and deep long-term harm. The information from the crime survey should be chilling to all of us. It estimates that 500,000 children every year experience some form of child sexual abuse, violence and sexual violation in the home, repeated rapes or exploitation by grooming or paedophile gangs, threats and intimidation involving intimate images online, abuse within institutions that should have protected and cared for young people, cruel and sadistic crimes against those who are most vulnerable. All of us have a responsibility to protect our children. Perpetrators must be punished and pursued. Victims and survivors must be protected and supported. But these crimes have not been taken seriously for too long, and far too many children have been failed. That is why this government is determined to act, strengthening the law, taking forward recommendations from independent inquiries, supporting stronger police action and protection for victims. There is no excuse for anyone not to take these crimes seriously. Brave survivors speaking out have shone a light on terrible crimes and the failure of institutions to act, be it in care homes in Rochdale, Asian grooming gangs in Rotherham or Telford, abuse that was covered up within faith institutions, including the Church of England and Catholic Church, or within family homes. And that report, alongside other appalling crimes coming to light, is why, in opposition, our party called for a national independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and supported that work when it was launched by the previous government. Over 7 years, that inquiry, expertly led by Professor Alexis Jay, engaged with more than 7,000 victims and survivors, processed 2 million pages of evidence, and published 61 reports and publications. Its findings should be truly disturbing for everyone, describing the pain and suffering caused to victims and survivors, the deviousness and cruelty of perpetrators. Nor is there any excuse for anyone not to recognise and act on the deep harm and damage from organised gang exploitation, abuse, sexual assaults and rape. 10 years ago, 2 reports by Alexis Jay and Louise Casey in Rotherham found that 1,400 children were sexually exploited, raped by multiple perpetrators, trafficked across other towns, abducted, beaten, threatened with guns, even children who had been doused in petrol, girls as young as 11 who were raped. And their reports identified then, a decade ago, a failure to confront Pakistani heritage gangs and, quote, a widespread perception that they should downplay the ethnic dimensions for fear of being seen to be racist. When those reports came out, those failings in Rotherham were condemned across the board by both government and opposition in this House. As I said at the time, it is never an excuse to use race and ethnicity or community relations as an excuse not to investigate and punish sex offenders. And the then Home Secretary made clear cultural concerns and fear of being seen as racist must never stand in the way of child protection. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse also ran a specific investigation strand into child sexual exploitation by organised networks. It ran for 2 years and produced a separate report in February 2022, which concluded that police forces and local councils were still failing to tackle this serious crime and set out further recommendations for change. But Madam Deputy Speaker, despite these different inquiries drawing up multiple recommendations, far too little has actually been done. None of the 20 recommendations from the independent inquiry into child abuse have been implemented. As the Act on Independent Child Abuse Campaign Group from the Survivors Trust has said this week, victims of child sexual abuse cannot afford further delays in meaningful action. And they said it is now imperative to keep the focus on radical reform. Two different Conservative Home Secretaries said after the report was published it was a watershed, should be the beginning of a new chapter for change, but that has not happened. We now need new impetus and action. Since coming into office, the Safeguarding Minister has met with Professor Alexis Jay and survivors and convened the first dedicated cross-government group to drive forward change and to ensure that victims' voices remain at the very heart of this process. I can tell the House that we will set up a new Victims and Survivors panel to work on an ongoing basis with the interministerial group to guide them on the design, delivery and implementation of new proposals and plans, not just on the ICSA inquiry, but on wider work around child sexual exploitation and abuse. And we will set out more details and timescales based on that work. But before that, I can announce action on three key recommendations. First, I can confirm we will make it mandatory to report abuse, and we will put the measures in the Crime and Policing Bill that will be put before Parliament this spring, making it an offence with professional and criminal sanctions to fail to report or cover up child sexual abuse. The protection of institutions must never be put before the protection of children. Madam Deputy Speaker, this measure is something I first called for in response to the reports and failings in Rotherham 10 years ago. It's something that the Prime Minister first called for 12 years ago, based on his experience as Director for Public Prosecutions. And the case was clear then, but we've lost a decade and we need to get on with it now. Second, we'll also legislate to make grooming an aggravating factor in the sentencing of child sexual offences, because the punishment must fit the terrible crime. And third, we will overhaul the information and evidence that is gathered on child sexual abuse and exploitation and embed it in a clear new performance framework for policing, so these crimes are taken far more seriously. The independent inquiry recommended as one of its first recommendations a single core data set on child abuse and protection, but that's never been done. We'll introduce a single child identifier in the Children and Wellbeing Bill and a much stronger police performance framework, including new standards on public protection, child abuse and exploitation. We're accelerating the work of the Child Sexual Exploitation Police Task Force, set up rightly under the previous government, and there has been a 25% increase in arrests between July and September of this year. That sits alongside the Tackling Organised Exploitation programme, which is using advanced data and analytics to uncover the complex networks. The data on ethnicity is now being published, but we will work further with them to improve the accuracy and robustness of the data and analysis. And we will continue to support further investigations that are needed, including police investigations and local independent inquiries and reviews which can expose failings and wrongdoing in local areas and institutions, as we've seen in Telford, in Rotherham and Greater Manchester. We support the ongoing work commissioned by Mayor Andy Burnham into historic abuse in Oldham, which has led to new police investigations, arrests and convictions. And to build on those findings, the Leader of Oldham Council has confirmed this week work to set up a further local independent inquiry is already underway, including liaison with Oldham survivors. We welcome and support this work, which will put victims' voices at its heart. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Telford inquiry was particularly effective because it involved victims in shaping the inquiry, and they were involved at every stage. So Tom Crowther, who led that inquiry, has now agreed to work with the government and with other local councils where stronger engagement with victims or survivors is needed, or where more formal inquiries are required to tackle persistent problems. But we should also be clear. Wherever there have been failings or that perpetrators of terrible crimes have not been brought to justice, the most important inquiries and investigations should be police investigations to track those perpetrators down, to bring them before the courts and to get the victims the protection that they deserve. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have to face the serious challenge that the fastest growing area of grooming and child abuse is now online. So we will also take much stronger action to crack down on rapidly evolving forms of child sexual exploitation and abuse and grooming online, including to tackle the exponential rise in AI-facilitated child sexual abuse material. And we will set out a significant package of measures to strengthen the law in this area in the coming weeks. For many years, there has been broad cross-party consensus, not only on the importance of this work, but that the interests of victims and survivors must come first. There will be different views about the details of the policies that are needed, but every one of us across this House has supported action to protect our children, and that is all our responsibility to keep them safe for the future. So I hope that members across the House will work with ministers and with the Victims and Survivors panel that we are setting up to change protection for the better and to make sure it is perpetrators who pay the price. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. The whole country is shocked by the rape gang scandal. Over years or decades, thousands and maybe tens of thousands of vulnerable young girls were systematically raped by organised gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage. Instead of those victims being protected and the perpetrators prosecuted, those girls were systematically failed. Many cases were covered up because of absurd concerns about so-called community relations. Police often did not investigate. Local councils covered things up. The Crown Prosecution Service frequently failed victims, and those raising concerns were frequently accused of racism. Never again can people be silenced in that way. And I pay tribute to people who have raised these cases over the years, starting, I think, with former Labour MP Anne Cryer nearly 2 decades ago, who first raised these problems and bravely persevered, despite accusations of racism and worse, including from her very own colleagues. And let me just say, in that vein, a word on the Prime Minister's comments this morning. It is not far right to stand up for victims of mass rape. And smearing people.
Order.
It's those concerns.
Shadow. People want to hear the statement. Chris Phil.
Smearing people who raise those issues is exactly how this ended up getting covered up in the first place. Now, I will, of course, repeat now what I said yesterday, that intimidation and threats towards elected members of Parliament and ministers, including the member for Birmingham Yardley, are completely wrong. Now, as the Home Secretary said, action is important, and the last government took extensive action, starting with the original Jay report commissioned in 2014 by previous Home Secretary, now Baroness May. A year later, she commissioned the independent investigation into child sexual abuse, and it was Sajid Javid who commissioned data collection in about 2018. Now, in relation to the response to the ICSA report published in 2022, it is not true to say the last government took no action. The last government established the Grooming Gangs Task Force, whose work led to 550 arrests of perpetrators in the first year and safeguarded 4,500 victims. So my first question to the Home Secretary is this: can she confirm to the House, I'm sure she can, but can she confirm to the House that the Grooming Gangs Task Force work will continue and I hope even be stepped up? Secondly, as part of the work of the Grooming Gangs Task Force, and again implementing one of the recommendations of the ICSA report, in April 2023, the last government mandated data collection in relation to ethnicity that the Home Secretary also referred to. Will she confirm, now it's been going for about a year and a half, or over a year and a half, will the Home Secretary now confirm that data on the ethnicity of perpetrators will be published? Now, as the Home Secretary, of course, has acknowledged, one of ICSA's main recommendations was mandatory reporting to the police by people in positions of responsibility. Now, the last government was in the process of implementing that recommendation via a measure in the Criminal Justice Bill which fell with the early election. Now, I'm glad to hear the Home Secretary has just announced that she will continue with the last government's proposals in her forthcoming bill, and she can be assured that the opposition will support the government in the continuation of that measure. Now, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary did not address the need for a full national public inquiry on this scandal. Now, while the last government did initiate the ICSA inquiry under Professor Jay, that was mainly directed at other child sexual abuse and exploitation issues, and it only covered 6 of the towns involved in the gang rape scandal. So it didn't cover everything. We do need to get to the truth. We now have evidence, new evidence of further that is of interest to the public, including what Simon Danchuk, the former Labour MP for Rochdale, said about the way he was pressured into staying silent. We have evidence about local authorities covering this up. We have the 3rd report last year on Operation Span, commissioned by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, exposing failings by the Crown Prosecution Service, which are extremely serious. This all needs to be looked into, so will the Home Secretary commission that national statutory public inquiry which can compel witnesses to attend, that can requisition evidence, and where it can take evidence under oath? And if the government will not order that statutory national public inquiry, we will table an amendment to the Children Wellbeing Bill later this week to put the matter to a vote. And I hope members across the House will vote for that full statutory public inquiry so we can get to the truth.
Home Secretary.
But just to say to the Shadow Home Secretary, this is an issue in which, when I was the Shadow Home Secretary, when I was the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I worked with government ministers on, and in which there has been cross-party consensus on the need to tackle these very serious and vile crimes. These are the most appalling crimes against children. The brutal rape, repeated multiple rapes of children, particularly young girls, but also young boys, in the most appalling of circumstances, and the abuse of trust for those children, often it be people who should have protected them, who should have looked after them, and where institutions failed to keep them safe. That's why the independent inquiry was so important. It's why I called for it. It's why many other people in this House, across this House, called for it, and it's why we supported it when the previous government set it up. But the truth is there just has not been enough action to tackle these vile crimes. There hasn't been enough change to policies, to the way in which services operate at local level. And that is a deep failing that those changes have not taken place. He used the example of the duty to report. This is incredibly important because it is about preventing any chance of people turning a blind eye, of professionals turning a blind eye to abuse, of people covering up child abuse and exploitation in the most appalling way. It's about making it a criminal offence, and yet we called for it 10 years ago. He had a decade in order to introduce that, a decade that we have now lost without having those powers and those measures in place. He rightly talks about the task force. I mentioned that in my response, and we've supported. It's not just continuing with that task force, but actually accelerating its work. So it has increased. The last quarter of arrests have increased on the previous quarter, a significant increase in arrests, because the thing I want to see most of all is I want to see perpetrators behind bars. I want to see perpetrators pay the price for the vile crimes against children. And in order to do that, we have to improve policing performance and the coordinated work between police and local councils across the country in order to do this. So yes, we will accelerate the work of the task force. But he refers to the ethnicity data. It's already been published. It was published in November. The latest report was published in November.
as a result of the work of the task force. I would just say to him, though, I don't think that the data that they have gathered actually is adequate. I don't think it goes far enough. I think there's a real problem with the way in which we collect data and police forces collect data. It's very haphazard. There isn't a proper system for collecting data, for having proper performance framework for policing, because again, to be honest, I think his government withdrew too far from policing and having the kind of standards we need to have in place. I hope we can work together on having a stronger performance framework, having a clearer framework of data, including dealing with these issues around ethnicity. And the issue back in 2015, we had the consensus on the need to make sure that race and ethnicity are never used as an excuse not to tackle crime. That somehow the fact that vulnerable girls supposedly consented when they did not is used as an excuse not to tackle crime. We can never accept those excuses. I hope that we will have agreement between us on how we do that. And in terms of inquiries, I would just say to him, his party launched the child abuse inquiry. They set the terms of reference. They provided the substantial funding for it. And he could have raised concerns about its terms of reference, about the scope of it, about the extent of its reports at any point, including at any point since it reported. And he didn't do so until last week. I hope he will support now the work that Oldham is determined to take forward, the work that we can hopefully see replicated from Telford. The Telford inquiry was a really important one. And I hope, too, that he is prepared to work with the victims and survivors panel, which will help us take forward exactly the kinds of further investigations, reviews and inquiries that should take place both at local level and across the country in order to make sure we protect child victims.
Select Committee Chair Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. Child sexual exploitation and abuse is a heinous crime. It happens everywhere, in all communities, in all settings. And we must all be vigilant and do what we can to address that. My right honourable friend mentioned the importance of ensuring that victims of CSA are at the heart of all that we do, and I support it wholeheartedly with that. And if it is the will of these victims of abuse in Oldham to have an additional review of the circumstances which led to their abuse, then I will also be wholeheartedly supporting that. But can my right honourable friend expand on how we can transparently track progress with the completion dates set for the recommendations? It can't be allowed that we have the detailed recommendations from a national independent inquiry and 3 years later we're still waiting for them to be implemented.
My honourable friend makes a really important point. I know she has worked immensely hard to champion victims and survivors of terrible crimes. She raises a really important point about the prevalence of these appalling crimes and need to be vigilant everywhere about wherever it might be found in any kind of institution across communities and across the country, but also on the importance of tracking progress. The importance of the way that the Telford inquiry was set up was that Tom Crowther, who led the inquiry, goes back each year to do a follow-up report and to track progress. That has been really important, and we have encouraged those looking at this in Oldham to also be in touch with those who are involved in Telford, and I'm glad that Tom Crowther has agreed to work with the government on how we can make this work more widely.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. No child should ever have to face sexual exploitation or abuse. There should simply be no place for this horrific, abhorrent behaviour in our society, and we must keep every child and young person impacted by these terrible, sickening crimes in our thoughts today. We owe it to these survivors to ensure that justice is delivered, and that means requiring perpetrators to face the full force of the law, but also ensuring the right steps are taken to prevent children from facing this vile abuse in the future. The expansive independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which published its report in 2022 sets out how to do just that. But under the previous Conservative government, progress of implementing these recommendations stalled, with Professor Alexis Jay, the chair of the inquiry, saying she was frustrated by the then government's lack of action. So could the Home Secretary say when we can expect the clear timeline for the full implementation of the ICSA recommendations, like Professor Jay has urged? And that work, of course, cannot be siloed in the Home Office alone. So I would welcome more details on how work will be coordinated across government to implement the ICSA recommendations. Victims and survivors deserve more than warm words. They deserve action. And it is my sincere hope that we across this House can work together to make this a reality and resist turning far too many children suffering into a political football. Thank you.
Home Secretary.
Can I welcome the points that the Honourable Member has made? I do think this is an issue where historically there has been a lot of sense of consensus across the House about the importance of this work, often though in the face of there being very slow progress, and that is what we have to change. She rightly asks about how this is not just a matter for the Home Office, it's not just even a matter for police forces or for local council social services. This has to be about work across government but also across communities. So that's why the Safeguarding Minister is leading a cross-departmental programme of work on responding to not just to the ICSA recommendations but to broader work, because some of the work around online abuse is moving extremely fast and we need other action there as well. But the important thing is we need to set up the Victims and Survivors panel to work with this group, because the victims and survivors need to be at the heart of the implementation, not just to feel like they gave evidence to an inquiry and then that was it. Nobody ever listened again.
Committee Chair Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Several years ago, I supported my constituent who suffered horrific sexual abuse as a child in the care of Lambeth Council over a number of months as she prepared to give her evidence to the independent inquiry on child sexual abuse chaired by Professor Jay. It was unimaginably hard for victims and survivors to give evidence to that inquiry, reliving the abuse they suffered and re-traumatising them over again. But the fact that they did so was exceptionally important, and I pay tribute to their courage.
Hear, hear.
My constituent and thousands of other victims and survivors gave their evidence so that their experiences could be at the heart of Professor Jay's recommendations. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that if we are really to put victims and survivors first, the priority must be to act on what they have already told us and to implement the ICSA recommendations at pace and in full?
Secretary.
Can I join my honourable friend in paying tribute not just to her constituent but to the more than 7,000 people, victims and survivors who gave evidence to the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and exploitation. The inquiry took 7 years, but that was very many years of people bravely speaking out about some of the most difficult and traumatic things imaginable, and that none of us would ever want anybody to have to go through. But she is also right that they cannot feel that those were just empty words that got lost in the air even though an inquiry took place. We have to make sure that there is action. Some of that action may be difficult, some of it may require very hard work, but we have to make sure we take that forward and make progress to protect children for the future.
Committee Member Robin Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Rape gangs and the grooming of children has haunted Keighley and the wider Bradford district for decades, yet local leaders have consistently refused to launch an inquiry. The National Independent ICSA report the Home Secretary is treating as a silver bullet wasn't an inquiry into rape gangs, and nor does it reference Keighley or Bradford once, despite many, including myself, fearing that the scale of this issue across the Bradford district will dwarf that of Rotherham. So if the Home Secretary believes that the ICSA report gives us all the information we need to tackle this vile and disgusting crime, can she tell me how many children across the Bradford district have been abused through child sexual exploitation? Who are the perpetrators? And when will my constituents expect to see them behind bars or deported?
Madam Deputy Speaker, there are appalling crimes that have taken place against children. in Bradford, in Keighley and across the country. Truly appalling crimes. And we also have to, all of us, face up to the fact that child sexual abuse and exploitation continues. This is not just about historic crimes, this is about continuing crimes and abuse for hundreds of thousands of children across the country. And that is why it is so important, first of all, that we take forward the reforms that have been proposed, that we make sure we have the way to keep victims and survivors' voices at the very heart of this. But some of it has got to be about how we change the way that policing and councils work together, implementing changes and reforms, including on the duty to report. And what we are also doing, because he obviously raises particular local concerns, what we will also be doing is working with Tom Crowther and with the Victims and Survivors panel on how best local areas can best involve survivors and victims in what has happened in their area to make sure that victims and survivors are properly listened to, that they can get to the truth, and also that fundamental changes take place for the future.
Paul Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the last few days, my town's name, my hometown's name, Rochdale, has been exploited by some people who treat child rape as a political game rather than as an appalling crime that should be dealt with. The horrific abuse of children by grooming gangs, many of them predominantly Pakistani heritage grooming gangs, was compounded by failures by my local council and by the local police. All Rochdalians, whatever their background, want to see sex offenders prosecuted swiftly and punished harshly. So, can I welcome the Home Secretary's statement today, and can I ask her to leave no stone unturned in implementing all the recommendations of the J report, something the opposition signally failed to do?
Home Secretary.
Well, my right honourable friend is right to recognise the seriousness of these crimes. Obviously the experiences in Rochdale, including not just the issues around gang networks and the Pakistani heritage gang networks that he talks about, but also some of the experiences in care homes that took place as well, some of the other issues that have been investigated over the years, and the terrible experiences of victims and survivors and their families as a result. But he's also right to say that what we actually need is change. And that has to be about how we work with victims and survivors on taking forward new reforms and changes, but also how we're going to have to go further in a series of areas, because the thing about child abuse and exploitation is that perpetrators change this all the time and they look for new ways to abuse children, and that is what we have to keep tackling.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. One of the most shocking details of the rape gangs is the evidence of collusion and corruption among police officers, social workers and local councillors. Will the Home Secretary commit today to establishing a unit in the NCA dedicated to investigating not only the untried perpetrators, but the police officers, social workers and local councillors complicit in these disgusting crimes?
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member makes an important point, which is that alongside the issues around pursuing the perpetrators, which always has to be the greatest priority, because that is about protecting victims and making sure those who commit vile crimes face justice, there also has to be a responsibility on people for their own public roles, whether that be in policing, in local councils, but also in other institutions, as we've seen issues around the Church of England, issues around the Catholic Church and other institutions that were investigated as part of the inquiry. But one of the reasons that we are so keen to change the law, and indeed it's something that I raised back when he was working in the Home Office, was the importance of changing the law on the duty to report, is that is what then makes it an offence if you have public officials who are covering up or who are failing to report. And that's why it's so important that we do that, so we can have proper accountability as well.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I sincerely commend the Home Secretary's statement. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse was extremely comprehensive. Over the course of 7 years, it examined 2 million pages of evidence, and heard from over 7,000 survivors, every single one of whom we should pay tribute to today. They relived the most horrific trauma only for the last government to drag its heels on implementing the report's recommendations. Calls now for a fresh inquiry from the Conservatives and Reform are a shameful attempt to stoke division at the expense of victims, survivors and children. So I thank the Home Secretary for refusing to give in to this deeply harmful and offensive political point scoring. And I ask, can she set out a timeline of when she expects to have fully implemented the ICSA recommendations?
Home Secretary.
Well, I think that the clear point, as my honourable friend says, is that victims and survivors need to be at the heart of the work to take forward implementation of reforms and changes. We want to work with the new Victims and Survivors panel in order to draw up timelines. And I do recognise that some of the areas around reform are difficult. So this is something where we need extensive work with victims and survivors on how to do so. But there are other areas that we can move really swiftly on, like changing the law on the duty to report, like changing and overhauling the way in which we collect information and data, and we have proper monitoring systems in place in local areas around child sexual exploitation and abuse. But what I hope we can build is the same sense of consensus about what our objectives are, which is to protect children. That's what this should all be about, and that is something that I hope everyone will sign up to.
Josh Rowland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Considerable evidence tells us that children exposed to domestic violence are at increased risk of abuse themselves. And growing up, I was one of those children. And as a survivor, I am appalled to see the Shadow Home Secretary weaponise this issue in the way that we just saw. I am appalled to see the likes of Reform play this issue like a political football. And I am appalled that 0 out of the 20 recommendations in Professor Jay's report have been implemented so far. Now, in light of the link between domestic abuse and child abuse, I've tabled a bill to create a dedicated set of domestic abuse offences in the law for the first time. I want to ask whether the Home Secretary will meet with me to discuss the provisions of this bill so that we can see how we can better respect and protect survivors across the country.
Can I just thank the honourable member for speaking out about his personal experiences, because I realise that that is never an easy thing to do, and to just show respect to him for doing so. He is also right that there are all kinds of links. The domestic abuse in the household has an incredibly damaging impact on the family, on children growing up, and we have to see the work around the protection of children as part of wider work around public protection. It's why we see this work as being strongly linked to the mission that we have set as a government over the next 10 years to halve violence against women and girls. And my honourable friend, the Safeguarding Minister, will be very keen to meet with the honourable member about the proposals that he has around domestic abuse and how we can work together on those issues.
The level of interest shows how important this issue is, but I'm going to struggle to get everybody in unless they keep their questions short and the answers just as short as well. I call Select Committee Member Chris Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The focus in this debate should not be on the politics or what's in the newspapers or what's on social media. It should be on the children themselves. For 4 years before coming here, I worked on preventing trafficking, especially child victims who had been trafficked around the country for sex. The stories that I heard there would chill your bones, especially those who sought protection from the authorities but ended up back in the hands of their traffickers. There is so much more we could do for those children. I know that not just from my own experience, but because it is there in black and white in the findings of these inquiries. We have 2 million pages of evidence, 700 witnesses, and 0 recommendations have been implemented. Will the Home Secretary commit to safeguarding, putting safeguarding first and not putting politics first, as people so transparently are trying to do, and implement the findings as fast as possible?
Secretary.
I welcome the work that my honourable friend has done in this area. He's right to talk about young people and children being trafficked around the country. There is some evidence and concern, for example, that whilst work has been done to identify people being trafficked around through county lines, and particularly often that will be boys and young men, but not sufficiently identifying young women and teenage girls who are being trafficked around for sexual exploitation, and we need to make sure that improvements are made there.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Labour lot over there are banging on about playing politics with this important issue. But the last time I attended a debate on child rape gangs, there was just one Labour backbencher turned up. They should hang their heads in shame. But will the Home Secretary agree with me that we need a specific inquiry into why young British white girls are being systematically raped by men of Pakistani heritage?
Secretary.
We need to make sure that young people, that children are being protected. These are vile crimes against children, and across the country we have seen young girls, we have seen teenagers, and we have seen young boys who have been exploited in the most cruel and horrendous way by perpetrators. We have seen the abuse by Pakistani heritage gangs, paedophile gangs operating online. We have seen abuse in communities and institutions and in family homes. All of those crimes are truly horrendous. It's why after the Rotherham inquiry in 2014, when we saw the appalling abuse, including by a Pakistani heritage gang in that case, I called for the duty to report. I called for the law to be changed so that it was a responsibility on public servants to report child abuse, and that it would be an offence to cover up child abuse. The government that he was part of for many years failed to bring that duty to report in. They failed to do so, and we have lost a decade. We have to change the law. We have to make sure that we go after abuse without fear or favour wherever it is found, in order to get justice for victims, protection for victims, and make sure that dangerous perpetrators end up behind bars.
Anna Dixon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to associate myself with the remarks of the Home Secretary in condemning those who perpetrate these horrific crimes, and I stand with all victims of child sexual exploitation and sexual violence. As the Honourable Member for Keighley knows, there has been an independent review in Bradford. It took place and reported in 2021 into child sexual exploitation, and a cross-party committee there has overseen those local changes. Alongside that, I would like to actually commend some of the actions by West Yorkshire Police, locking up over 20 perpetrators since 2021. So does my right honourable friend agree that the failure of the previous government to take action on the J report is a disgrace, and what further actions are needed by police and local authorities to tackle these pernicious crimes?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend rightly refers to work done by West Yorkshire Police, both to look at public protection currently, but also to pursue historic investigations as well. And those continue to be important. Very often, people will only come forward to be able to tell their story about the abuse that has taken place many years later. And it's incredibly important that those, when survivors are brave enough to come forward, that is fully investigated, and that operations like those run by West Yorkshire Police continue into that historic abuse as well. But the thing that we owe to victims and survivors is to make sure that change happens in practice, including changing the law as part of the Crime and Policing Bill.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for her statement, and it's important, I think, to remember that these terrible crimes could happen to anyone, and be perpetrated by anyone, irrespective of colour, class, heritage, geography. I think she's right. I think the public want to see action now. I remain, frankly, not convinced that a new public inquiry will throw any new light or information on this issue. And the best place for victims to have their stories told is actually in court when the perpetrators are brought to justice. But could I ask the Home Secretary to make clear to the world of local government and policing that the implementation of rules and regulations are colour and class blind. Too many of these victims were just simply dismissed as, to use that media phrase, white trash. They were poor, not particularly well educated in many instances, often in trouble with the authorities, and too easily dismissed. That's where the failure really took place. They were dismissed for who they were. That can never happen again.
Can I welcome the points, the really important points that the honourable member has made, because and also the point that he makes about the response has to be colour blind, class blind, has to see crimes for what they are, because that is what it is, really terrible crimes, often, as he says, against the most vulnerable young people. And we did have young people who were dismissed actually because they were vulnerable, because of the difficult experiences that they might have had. Often young girls just not taken seriously, and the myths that were operating within the way that services responded. A lot of work has been done to challenge those myths, but the reality is, unless you have proper strong performance management frameworks in place, unless you have strong requirements on local organisations and agencies to respond and to take this seriously enough, the risk is that it just becomes lost in a corner as opposed to treated as the very serious crime that it is. And that's why we want to embed this as part of a proper performance framework for policing and working with local councils too.
Joe White. Professor Jay heard from my constituent, Terry Lodge, who was fostered and lived a life of slavery with no education and no childhood, and he has suffered the consequences throughout his life. Nottinghamshire County Council accepted all liability for their failings. To their shame, they are still to make an offer of compensation. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that whilst Jay's recommendations must be implemented in full, Nottinghamshire County Council must also step up and do the right thing?
Home Secretary.
My honourable friend makes a really important point about the responsibility on local councils to recognise the things that have gone wrong in the past, and to recognise the responsibilities they owe to local victims, to local survivors, and to provide the support that those victims and survivors need. I know my honourable friend, the Safeguarding Minister, will keep in touch with her about progress, but it is really important that all councils make sure they recognise their responsibilities.
Shaukat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Perpetrators of sexual crimes must face the full force of the law regardless of their race, their religion or their nationality. But an overseas bad faith actor is using truly horrific cases of group-based child rape to demonise a community and slander a minister of the Crown, someone who has genuine experiences in helping the victims of abuse. This narrative is false, and this narrative is dangerous. Many reports from 2015 to 2024 have concluded that the common denominator for sexual violence is not immigration, race or culture. Isn't this the real point here? If the victims are being falsely told perpetrators look a certain way or are part of a certain community, they will have a false sense of security when with people who don't fit that stereotype. The real issue here is we need discussion to be focused around victims and not political rhetoric, and we need evidence-based policies.
Secretary.
Well, one of the points that the independent inquiry made was the broad nature of this abuse and the way in which it can be found anywhere. When you have 500,000 children being subjected to child sexual abuse or exploitation every year,
That is an impact right across the country. It means you have the real serious problems and failings within all kinds of different institutions, as the inquiry found, looking into issues within local councils, within care homes, within faith organisations, including the Church of England, within different grooming and exploitation groups. Wherever it is found, we have to have these treated as terrible crimes against children. No excuses. No excuses made for perpetrators. No excuses made for inaction. There has to be strong action to go after the perpetrators, whomsoever they are, wheresoever they are, and protection for the victims, whomsoever they are and wherever they are too.
Oliver Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her statement? With this government, no matter race, no matter where they are, abusers will have nowhere to hide, and the job in hand is action, implementation and change. I'm glad to hear that she'll be setting up a new victims panel, because it's the victims of this sexual abuse, women and children, who are usually forgotten in this wild whirlwind of Twitter, who I have to say is usually men using this to grind a political axe. Does she agree with me that this is not a bandwagon to jump on for anybody's political TV talk show? This is a serious issue. These are victims that deserve to lead this process as we go through, and I'm sure she will do that.
Yeah. Well, these are really serious crimes, and for someone like Alexis Jay, who has been working in this area over very, very many years, and before she led the independent inquiry, and for others who have been working in this area over very many years, it has to be about the victims and survivors, but it also has to be about getting serious about delivering change and making sure that change happens in practice. And therefore, one of the things has got to be about how we make sure there are proper monitoring processes to follow up change, rather than just to think, well, there's an announcement being made, but nothing changes and nothing is actually done. That is far more important than the debates that take place on social media, is what is the practical plan for delivering change.
Wendy Morton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has been very keen to set up 60 reviews since coming into office, including one in social care, but it's refused, Madam Deputy Speaker, a formal request from Oldham Council for a national statutory inquiry into child sexual abuse and on grooming and gang rape. So why? Why not let sunlight and transparency and justice into the process?
Home Secretary.
Well, I would just say to her, as I made clear in my statement, we support the independent review that Oldham Council is planning to set up. We have also made clear to them that we suggest that they work with those who were involved in the Telford inquiry, which was extremely effective. Tom Crowther, who led that inquiry, has agreed to do so. And interestingly, one of those who gave evidence both to the Telford inquiry and also to the national inquiry has described how she found the impact of the Telford inquiry was actually much easier for her to give evidence to, and thought was more effective at getting to the nitty-gritty of what had gone wrong in Telford. And I suspect that is why her previous government, the government that she was a part of, also said repeatedly to Oldham that they should pursue the local inquiry. But we want to make sure that there are proper investigations, inquiries and reviews wherever there is evidence that needs to be pursued. Most important of all, there have to be police investigations to get justice.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 2014 and 15, the then HCLG Select Committee did an inquiry of just reports into CSE in Rotherham. Those reports that we did drew very heavily on the evidence from Alexis Stray's first report, which was into Rotherham, and the problems there, the failings of the police, the failings of the council, the failings of Ofsted as well. What that shows surely is that a local authority commissioned inquiry, which what Alexis Jay's first inquiry was, can get to the bottom of these problems, can expose the failings, and can lead to improvements at local level. Surely Oldham can do exactly the same.
Secretary.
Well, that is the work, my honourable friend is right, because that is the work that Oldham are now taking forward. We want to work with Oldham, we want to be able to support them and we want them to be able to see the work that was done in Telford that was effective at delivering change. And Ted Crowther goes back to see the work in Telford to make sure that progress is being made. And that is crucial, because it's no good just having inquiries that then don't actually lead to any change or anything different happening. There has to be both the detailed work, be that at local level or be that at national level, but there also has to be follow through too.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Labour Welsh Government is responsible for child safeguarding in Wales. And the Secretary of State said that none of the independent inquiry's 20 recommendations were implemented by the previous Tory government. 6 recommendations applied to Wales. No new actions were actually taken there either. Given that her statement rightly puts victims and survivors first, will she tell me how victims and survivors in Wales will now be able to demand a culture of real change?
Good question.
Home Secretary.
So there are many issues which obviously cut across, including issues around policing, which apply to England and Wales. For example, the police performance framework that we're talking about, some of the data issues that we're talking about. So, of course, we need Welsh police forces. We need to work with the Welsh Government on taking those measures forward. They are immensely important, because part of the problem has been that when there is not a sense of what is it actually being measured, what is the things that are actually going to change, what are the performance standards that we expect from all police forces right across the country, if those don't exist, then in practice too little changes. That performance management framework has been missing from Wales as well as from across England, and that is what we're determined to introduce.
Harpreet Tupple.
Madam Speaker. The horrific cases of CSC and rape across the country have exposed deep failures in the safeguarding of vulnerable children. And as other members have said, unfortunately too many times they were not viewed or treated as children by the agencies that should have supported them. So can I welcome the steps that the Secretary of State has set out, but can she ensure that there is long-term funding to support survivors to rebuild their lives, so that their voices lead on reform, and that we support local charities like the ones in my constituency, including Kirklees Rape and Sexual Assault Centre and Pennine Domestic Abuse Partnership, who do fantastic work but are constantly having to fight for funding every year? Thank you.
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising the local service, which my honourable friend of the Safeguarding Minister also is a strong supporter of the work that that service is doing. She's right about the importance of making sure that we support victims and survivors. We need to work with the Victims and Survivors panel on how we take that forward. She's also right to say part of the problem is that children were not treated as children, and they were not respected as children. They were just treated as being somehow adults that satisfy, and not treated as being exploited and being subjected to the most terrible of crimes. And that's one of the fundamental things that has to change.
Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also thank the Secretary of State for her statement? And initially, just to point out, I think the House overwhelmingly is behind her dealing with these very difficult subjects and implementing the findings of the Jay report. But the arguments against a further public inquiry, I'm listening very carefully to these exchanges, seem to me rather thin in response to my honourable friend for Keighley, for example. Oh, we've already got too much to do. Oh, it probably won't find out anything new. Oh, let the council do it on its own. I just wonder whether, in fact, it's a matter of public confidence. And if she cannot restore public confidence without a further public inquiry, please will she not rule it out?
Well, let me be clear that we obviously supported the independent inquiry into child abuse, including the 2-year investigation that it did into organised networks of child sexual exploitation. That was immensely important as well. And we also continue to support the local inquiries, reviews and investigations, including Oldham. I have particularly highlighted the work that was done in Telford, and there is a reason for that. The Telford inquiry was set up as a local independent inquiry, but has proved more effective than many of the other pieces of work that have been undertaken in this area, both in terms of having victims and survivors from the very beginning at the heart of that local inquiry. They were involved not just in giving evidence, but also in drawing up and shaping the whole way that the inquiry went forward. And they have in place a proper framework for following up, for making sure that a year later progress is being made, that action is actually being taken. And we want to learn from what worked effectively in Telford. Interestingly, that is different from what's happened in some other areas, so it's significant the way in which that has worked. And that's why we believe that the next steps, the right next steps on this, is for Tom Crowther, who led that, to work, and from those who were involved, victims and survivors who were involved in Telford, to be able to share that experience with other areas, including with Oldham and including other areas, so that we make sure we actually have a proper framework for local areas and institutions to be able to get to the truth about what has happened in their area and to make sure that changes take place. And at the same time, recognising we've had the 2-year inquiry into child exploitation nationally as part of the overarching review, and we have a series of recommendations that the overarching review made that still haven't been acted on. So let's work with the Victims and Survivors panel that we are determined to set up on what is the best form for future investigations and future work.
I'm only planning to run the statement until 7, so it might be helpful if we have very short questions and perhaps shorter answers from the Home Secretary. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Secretary. Can I, on behalf of every decent-minded MP across this House, just say how powerful and important it is to see the Safeguarding Minister here on the front bench and the Home Secretary, because it is a testament to their commitment to getting this matter right and not being deflected, however hard other people try, from what really matters, which is the victims of these horrific crimes. I'm proud to sit behind them and to support the work that they are doing. And I welcome what they say about bringing up a victims panel. And in the spirit of the cross-party working that I think we're going to need to do on this, can I also welcome the words of the member from North Dorset, because he's right. The common story we hear with victims of abuse time and time again, whether of grooming gangs, whether in care homes, whether in their own homes, is that they weren't believed. Nobody listened to them. So how can we have the national conversation we do need to have about the culture of belief and putting victims first and finally ending the silence that means so many for so long have been the victims of these perpetrators?
My honourable friend is right. We have to make sure that the victims' voices are heard, and also that they can have the confidence to come forward, because very often victims are not heard because they don't feel actually that they will be believed, or they don't feel that they will be able to get support they need if they do speak out, and that can make it extremely difficult. And can I also support the words that she said about the Safeguarding Minister, who not only does a phenomenal job in the Home Office now, but has also been a tireless champion through very many years for victims of abuse, for victims of exploitation, and without her there is no doubt that the Home Office would not be making the progress we are now making in terms of tackling these very serious crimes.
Neil O'Brien.
Many victims of the grooming gang still don't feel that justice has been done. It's very, very concerning that the 2 men leading the Greater Manchester inquiry resigned because they felt they were being blocked from accessing the information that they needed. Now, ICSO was a very important start, but what it was not, and was never meant to be, was a detailed report into the grooming gangs. They looked at 6 places where the grooming gangs operated, but there were more than 40 places where grooming gangs operated. The Right Honourable Lady says, well, the answer is locally led inquiries. But we've had years for that to happen, and it has not happened, and not happened properly. And indeed, in many cases, the local authorities were part of the problem, so you're asking them to mark their own homework. So I totally agree with the Home Secretary about the importance of the J recommendations, but will she please rethink so we can actually listen to the voices of those who have never been listened to this day?
Secretary.
Well, I would say to them, the whole point of us setting up a victims and survivors panel is to make sure that the victims and survivors' voices continue to be heard as part of the implementation, as part of the action, and as part of the further investigations that need to take place. This cannot simply be we had a one-off inquiry and then everybody turns their backs and moves on and talks about something different. What we have to do is to make sure that there is a serious change. There obviously was a two-year inquiry that looked at organised grooming gangs and child exploitation, but we've also had, of course, the issues around Telford. Telford was not included in detail as part of that, and there will be other areas where there are detailed questions still unresolved, and that is why we want Tom Crowther to be able to work with the government and with other areas on how best to make sure that victims and survivors, in the way that he describes, do feel like their voices will be heard, because he is right. Too often they don't feel that, and often that is also because, frankly, we still need further police investigations into those crimes, and the perpetrators of the terrible crimes against them still haven't been brought to justice.
Emma Foodie.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Anyone who has worked with survivors, as I have, knows how extraordinarily painful but how important it was to have the ICSA inquiry, for survivors to be heard, to be believed, and crucially to finally see action taken. And I pay tribute to the thousands of survivors who participated in the inquiry, survivors who should not have to repeatedly relive their trauma to see action finally be taken. They've told us now is the time for action. And I can only refer to the quotes recently from Alexis J, who described the inaction of the previous government as weak and apparently disingenuous with regards to what they did. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that the way to protect vulnerable children is to take action and implement the recommendations as quickly as possible? Home Secretary.
We do need to take forward the work around the inquiry. We do need that work to take place actually on a continuing basis with victims and survivors. I think I would also highlight there are some areas, though, that will need to go well beyond the independent inquiry. The way in which online abuse is accelerating, online grooming is accelerating. There are gangs and organised networks who are operating online and then drawing young people offline for physical abuse, but also for the sharing of terrible images as well. That is a massive growing crime, and I am really, really worried about it. Yeah. And we are going to need much stronger action, and whether that is about social media companies taking more responsibility, whether that is about stronger measures online, we will need more action there.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Alexis J's independent inquiry into child sexual abuse has not been fully implemented, and the inquiry recommended legislating to force tech firms to take stronger action over online abuse material. Since then, this House has, of course, passed the Online Safety Act, and Ofcom set out its implementation plans last October. But how can the government ensure that tech companies take stronger action over online abuse?
Home Secretary.
Well, he's right to refer to the Online Safety Act. That obviously took longer than I wish it had to come into force, but it is now being implemented. And that does mean new measures coming in place in the spring, further measures and requirements in the summer. But we will also come forward with further measures on issues around the online exploitation and abuse, and we will set those out in due course.
Melanie On.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome the Home Secretary's response today and her statement, and look forward to the timeline that she's going to present around the implementation of the recommendations. In her statement, she did mention support and belief for victims and survivors. One of the biggest supportive actions she could take would be to consider stopping convicted CSE rapists from seeing their children born from these crimes once they are convicted, because they use access to their children to continue their abuse and re-victimise the girls whose lives that they have already ruined once.
Home Secretary.
My honourable friend makes a really important point, because this can be the way, a most appalling way
of abuse continuing, because that's what it is, and of abusers being effectively able to use the courts or to be able to use other institutions to continue their abuse and exploitation. We will be taking action in this area. We will be putting forward more measures, and both the Safeguarding Minister and the Victims Minister can have further discussions with her about that.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Telford, you saw the systematic abuse of so many children who were raped, and you saw a cover-up by police and council officials. Yet not a single member of the police force or council official in Telford has gone to jail, or anywhere else in the country has gone to jail. Can the Secretary of State use her power to set up, as was referred to by my honourable friend, a specialist unit within the National Crime Agency to look at this, to make sure some of those who covered these crimes up are held to account?
So, I do actually think there does need to be stronger action around accountability. And so I think he makes a serious point here about these issues in terms of across public services. But I would also say to him that one of the most effective ways to be able to do that means you have to strengthen the legal framework in the first place. You have to strengthen the legal requirements on those who are responsible, including the duty to report, but also making clear that it is an offence to block or to cover up, and making sure that where there are existing powers, they are properly used, but also making sure that we strengthen them. And I would again just gently say to the honourable member, he was a government minister, including at different times an education minister, for over very many years when people were calling for the strengthening of the law. I do hope he will support that strengthening of the law now, even though he didn't at the time.
Blair McDougall.
Deputy Speaker, can I warmly welcome the measures the Home Secretary set out to pursue perpetrators, to challenge the culture of cover-up, but also her strong statement that nobody should resist the urge to report child rape because of a fear of being labelled as racist. Can I also ask her whether she shares my contempt of those who will take the suffering of victims and weaponise it, particularly through online disinformation, to pursue their own hateful agendas? The attacks by Elon Musk on the Minister for Safeguarding crossed the line for me in the last few days, and earlier I deactivated my X account. And I wonder at what point for the Home Secretary does the continuing presence of government departments on that platform legitimise a space that's not only poisonous now, but is actually dangerous?
Home Secretary.
Well, I think the honourable member is right to say that this has to be about showing respect for victims. It cannot be about just perpetuating misinformation online for the sake of clicks, for the sake of audiences. This has to be about respect for victims and for survivors, and for the practical changes that we have a responsibility to take. I hope in this House we can stick with what has been really the sort of core traditions of the way that this House works, is that actually when we are sitting in front of each other, across the dispatch box from each other or across the chamber from each other, we talk about what really matters to people and to our constituents, rather than simply chasing headlines online.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I welcome the measures which the Minister has announced today in terms of the mandatory reporting, the grooming being an aggregated factor, and also the better use of data. But the fact remains there is still suspicion, widespread suspicion, that there is cover-up because of the nature of these crimes and those who perpetrated them. And thus you not agree with me that there is need for a national inquiry, because it is now seen that it is a wider problem than what was originally envisaged. Secondly, the cover-up by public bodies has been disgraceful. And thirdly, there are allegations that CPS had a role in ensuring that people were not prosecuted. So rather than this being hiding behind the rhetoric that this is a far-right demand, would she not accept that this is a reasonable response from a government that says it wants to deal with the problem and wants to restore public confidence?
Secretary.
So the very reason that I many of us called for an independent inquiry in the first place many years ago was because of the deep concerns, both about the scale of abuse, about the scale of the abuse that was going hidden, and also about the total failure of institutions to respond, concerns about information being hidden, concerns about authorities not taking the action that they needed. That is why we called for an inquiry in the first place. That's why we had an independent inquiry that lasted 7 years, that the previous government invested, I think, over £150 million in that inquiry over 7 years, that it also rightly included a 2-year investigation into the grooming gangs, the organised child exploitation as well. But there are also areas where further work needs to be done in local areas, as I've referred to in Telford, as Oldham is now taking forward as well. But really, all of this goes back to the heart of ultimately what you need is the police investigations. The police in the end are the ones who have the powers to get to the truth about perpetrators who are committing crimes, to gather the evidence, to get them before court and to get them behind bars.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over 500,000 children every year are sexually abused, and there are about as many perpetrators of that. Yet there are some people on the opposite side who only want to focus on a few, rather than the big cases that we've heard come right across, whether it's TV presenters, Catholic Church and others. This is something we have to take seriously and not exploit or chase headlines or look for future funders for our political party. We are actually taking action led by 2 formidable women who will not let any abuser get away with exploiting women, men, or children anywhere, particularly online, which is an inquiry that we are beginning on the Science and Innovation Tech Committee tomorrow, looking at algorithms. Can the Home Secretary reassure the House that it is action that is the priority of this government, not further years of talking, and that is what survivors need?
Secretary. Well, my honourable friend is right that we do need action, that we need to see progress and change, that there will be further areas that will need investigations, inquiries. I welcome, for example, the inquiry she has just referred to on the Select Committee, particularly on online abuse and exploitation. Now, it says, as we're coming to the close, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that as well as the issue around my real concern, deep concern about the expansion of online, the other area I'm deeply concerned about is the expansion of young people being drawn into abuse as well, and the abuse between teenagers as well, because the exploitation and what is happening to harm young people that demonstrates, I think, is extremely serious, and that is escalating.
Final question, Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the House has agreed this afternoon that cultural sensitivity should not get in the way of police investigations, but it would appear that they have, and they perhaps still are, and that victims have been let down and that current victims may be being failed even today. There is a specific problem with gangs of organised men who are systematically raping and abusing young children. Within that group, there is an overrepresentation of men of Pakistani heritage. We need to understand why. A piecemeal investigation, town by town by town, is not going to do that. It's not going to serve the interests of victims, ensuring that they get the justice they deserve, and it's not going to prevent future cases.
Well, she raises an important point that was first raised as part of the J inquiry and then as the Casey inquiry more than 10 years ago. And she's also right that we need to see action, because there are real concerns that despite these issues having been raised over a decade ago, that in so many areas, not just around grooming gangs and exploitation, but actually around other areas of child sexual exploitation and child sexual abuse as well, there still hasn't been the action taken to change things. It's why we have to make sure that the action is taken. It's why we have to look at the recommendations that have already been made, including by the 2-year strand and inquiry as part of the independent child sexual abuse inquiry, but it's also why we then have to work with the Victims and Survivors panel on what are the further areas. I do think that we have to improve the ethnicity data that is really not adequate. We're publishing what we've got. It was published in November, but it's really not strong enough in terms of that data, because that can also inform the kinds of investigations that need to take place and make sure that we're looking at child abuse wherever it is found, wherever it is found across the country, whatever institution it is found in, whatever community it is found in. Crime is crime, and children need protecting wherever they are.
I thank the Home Secretary for that statement. Apologies to members who did not get in, but we have two further items of business. If the front benches would like to swap over.
So there you go. That was from the House of Commons there, troops. Again, did you learn too much? Again, let me know down there in the old comment section below. Reason why we live streamed that today was because there was at the same time there was the general election sort of thing that was going on in terms of the petition, so a lot of attention was diverted onto over there. And actually UK Parliament actually usually live stream this onto YouTube, but no one was, neither was any of the mainstream media except from Sky News that I sent in there in the end. So that kind of brings us to the end of today's live stream for there. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be talking about some other breaking news. You'll be redirected over there in a moment. But thank you for tuning in. Hit the like, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you all in